It is early morning in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, and mist is still sitting low over rows of tea bushes that climb the hillsides in perfect green terraces. Somewhere below, a train that looks like it belongs in a different century is winding along tracks cut into the mountainside, packed with people hanging out the open doors for the view. This is the image most people already have of Sri Lanka. It is real. It is also maybe 5% of the actual story. This is an island that has been inhabited for over 100,000 years, that built engineering marvels while most of Europe was still in the Dark Ages, and that has, within the last 2 decades alone, survived a war, a tsunami, and a full economic collapse. Most people know the postcard. Almost nobody knows the timeline underneath it. Start with the map. Sri Lanka is a teardrop-shaped island in the Indian Ocean, hanging just off the southeastern tip of India, separated from the mainland by a shallow strip of water called the Palk Strait. The whole country is roughly the size of Ireland, but packed into that space is a geography that shouldn't fit together as neatly as it does. Tropical beaches ringing the entire coastline, a cool mountainous interior where tea plantations thrive at altitude, and dense jungle national parks where wild elephants and leopards still roam in numbers. Most countries lost a century ago. The population sits at roughly 22 million people, and it is not a single-story nation. Sinhalese Buddhists make up close to 3/4 of the population. Tamils, mostly Hindu, form the largest minority, and Muslim communities have lived on the island for over 1,000 years, tracing back to Arab traders who settled the coast long before any European ship arrived. Add in smaller communities like the Burghers, descendants of Portuguese and Dutch colonists, and the Vedda, believed to be descendants of the island's original inhabitants. And you get a country whose identity has never been simple, and whose modern history is, in large part, a story about what happens when that complexity isn't handled well. Geographically, the island splits almost neatly into 3 zones stacked on top of each other. The coastal belt is tropical and humid year-round, home to most of the population and almost all of the tourist infrastructure. Climb inland, and the land rises into a cooler, wetter hill country, where temperatures can drop enough at night to need a sweater, a detail that surprises almost every first-time visitor who packed only for the beach. And further north and east, the terrain flattens back out into a dry zone, the same dry zone where those ancient irrigation-fed kingdoms once thrived, now a mix of scrubland, farmland, and some of the country's best wildlife parks. Now, the part almost no visitor expects. Sri Lanka has archaeological evidence of continuous human habitation, stretching back more than 100,000 years, making it one of the longest continuously inhabited places on Earth. But the part that really stops people is what happened over 2,000 years ago, when ancient Sinhalese kingdoms built cities like Anuradhapura and later Polonnaruwa, capitals with elaborate reservoir and canal systems engineered to capture monsoon rainfall and distribute it across the dry zone for irrigation. These weren't primitive waterworks. Some of the reservoirs built during this period are still in use today, close to 2,000 years after they were first constructed. A working irrigation network older than most of the countries that currently exist. Buddhism arrived on the island in the 3rd century BCE, reportedly brought by a mission sent from the Indian emperor Ashoka, and it became so deeply woven into Sinhalese identity that it remains the majority religion to this day. For centuries, Anuradhapura functioned as one of the great cities of the ancient world, with monasteries, palaces, and dagobas, massive dome-shaped Buddhist monuments, some of which still rank among the tallest brick structures ever built anywhere on Earth before the modern era. When that capital eventually declined, the center of power shifted to Polonnaruwa, which carried the same engineering tradition forward with even larger reservoirs and irrigation networks, feeding an agricultural economy that supported a sophisticated, literate, deeply organized society more than a millennium before European contact. Hold on to that timeline. We will get there. Here is a fact that says more about the island's modern culture than almost anything else. Sri Lanka was colonized 3 separate times by 3 different European powers, and each one left something permanent behind. The Portuguese arrived in the 16th century and controlled the coastal regions for roughly 150 years, introducing Catholicism, which remains present on the island today, along with a wave of Portuguese surnames still common among coastal families. The Dutch pushed the Portuguese out in the mid-1600s and held the coast for another century and a half, leaving behind canal systems, legal traditions, and architecture still visible in cities like Gal. Then came the British, who took full control of the island by 1815, the first European power to conquer the inland kingdom of Kandy, something neither the Portuguese nor the Dutch had managed. Under British rule, the island was renamed Ceylon, and the highland interior was transformed almost entirely for one purpose: tea. British planters cleared enormous stretches of hill country and replaced them with the tea estates that still define the landscape today, importing Tamil laborers from South India to work them. A demographic shift whose consequences would echo for the next century and a half. Each colonial layer stacked directly on top of the one before it, rather than replacing it entirely, which is part of why modern Sri Lanka can feel, in the space of a single day, like it's showing you 3 different centuries at once: a Dutch fort wall, a British-era train station, and a temple complex predating both by well over 1,000 years, sometimes within walking distance of each other. Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948, taking back its name and its sovereignty, but not, as it would turn out, its stability. But look closer, because the peaceful palm tree image most people carry skips over one of the longest civil conflicts in modern Asian history. Tensions between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority, many of them descendants of those British-era plantation laborers, escalated for decades after independence, fueled by language policy, unequal access to education and jobs, and rising nationalist politics on both sides. In 1983, that tension exploded into a full civil war between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, a militant group fighting for an independent Tamil state in the north and east of the island. The war lasted 26 years, displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and did not end until 2009, when government forces defeated the remaining Tamil Tiger leadership in a brutal final offensive that drew international criticism over civilian casualties. It remains one of the most sensitive and actively debated chapters in the country's modern history, and reconciliation between communities is still, by most accounts, an unfinished process rather than a resolved one. The scars of that war are still visible if you know where to look. Memorials in the north, a still cautious conversation around land and resettlement in formerly contested areas, and a political landscape where Tamil representation and reconciliation remain live, unresolved topics rather than settled history. Tourism itself was effectively frozen across large parts of the island for decades, which is part of why places like Jaffna in the north are only now, in the last several years, becoming reachable and known to international travelers, rather than existing purely as a wartime headline. This is the secret the title promised. Not a hidden landmark, but a hidden weight. The paradise photos were taken in a country that spent more than a quarter of a century at war with itself. Beyond the conflict, Sri Lanka has spent the last 2 decades absorbing shock after shock in a way few nations of its size have had to manage. On December 26, 2004, a massive undersea earthquake off Sumatra sent a tsunami crashing into Sri Lanka's coastline with almost no warning, killing more than 30,000 people on the island alone and displacing hundreds of thousands more. Entire coastal communities were rebuilt from scratch in the years that followed, and tsunami warning infrastructure now lines stretches of coast that had none before. Then, in 2022, came a different kind of disaster. Years of unsustainable borrowing, tax cuts, and a currency crisis collided with the aftershocks of the pandemic and pushed Sri Lanka into its worst economic crisis since independence. Fuel shortages left drivers queuing for days. Inflation soared. The country defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time in its history, and mass protests eventually forced the sitting president to flee the country and resign from exile. Sri Lanka has spent the years since in a slow, IMF-monitored recovery, rebuilding reserves and renegotiating debt, while ordinary households absorbed the cost of a currency that had lost a huge share of its value almost overnight. There was also a third shock sitting between those two, one that gets mentioned less often outside the region. Coordinated terrorist bombings on Easter Sunday in 2019 struck churches and hotels, killing more than 250 people and devastating the tourism industry just as it was recovering from years of underinvestment during the war. The country was still absorbing the reputational and economic damage of that attack when the pandemic hit, and it was still absorbing the pandemic's damage when the 2022 debt default arrived. 3 major shocks inside of roughly 5 years is not a normal stretch for any economy to weather. But here is the pivot, because the full picture matters more than the headline crisis. Growth has returned, the economy has been expanding again in recent years, and tourism, one of the fastest and most direct ways foreign currency enters the country, has been central to that rebound. Every visitor who comes for the beaches in the tea country is, whether they realize it or not, participating directly in a national recovery effort. Let's talk numbers, because the recovery only makes sense with real figures attached. Sri Lanka's GDP sits around $100 to $110 billion, with GDP per capita landing somewhere around $5,000 in nominal terms, considerably higher when adjusted for purchasing power, but still a fraction of wealthier regional economies. Growth has rebounded to roughly 5% annually in the past couple of years, a sharp turnaround from the depths of the 2022 collapse, though a meaningful share of the population still lives below the poverty line by international measures. Garments are the country's single largest export industry, with major international clothing brands manufacturing here, followed closely by tea, rubber, and gemstones. Sri Lanka is one of the world's leading producers of sapphires, including stones that have ended up in globally famous jewelry collections. Tourism, meanwhile, is being actively rebuilt as a pillar of the economy, with the government targeting several million international visitors annually as the sector claws back toward pre-crisis numbers. Tea deserves its own line in the spreadsheet, because few countries are as identified with a single crop. Sri Lankan tea, still sold internationally under the old colonial name Ceylon tea, is grown across distinct altitude zones that each produce a noticeably different flavor profile, a detail serious tea buyers pay close attention to, in much the same way wine drinkers care about which specific slope a vineyard sits on. The industry directly employs a huge share of the population in the Central Highlands, many of them descendants of the very Tamil laborers brought over during the British era, which means the crop that built colonial-era Ceylon is still, generations later, the crop supporting the communities whose ancestors were brought here to grow it. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying the journey, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. Here is a fact that says more about a whole country's character than almost anything else. Despite war, tsunami, and economic collapse inside of 20 years, Sri Lanka's cultural institutions never stopped functioning. Buddhist temples that have operated continuously for over 1,000 years kept their doors open through all of it. The ancient rock fortress of Sigiriya, built in the 5th century atop a 500-foot outcrop of stone, complete with frescoes and elaborate water gardens at its base, has survived earthquakes, colonization, and civil war fully intact enough to remain one of the most visited sites on the island today. Resilience here isn't written into slogans. It is written into stone reservoirs still carrying water after 2,000 years, and into temples that never closed even when the country around them was falling apart. You would not expect an island this size to hold this much biodiversity, and yet it does. Sri Lanka is recognized as a global biodiversity hotspot, home to Asian elephants that still move in wild herds through national parks like Udawalawe and Minaria, leopards at some of the highest population densities recorded anywhere on Earth in places like Yala National Park, and waters off the southern coast that are among the most reliable places in the world to spot blue whales, the largest animals to have ever lived on the planet. The island holds 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites packed into a relatively small footprint: ancient cities, sacred temple complexes, rainforest reserves, and colonial fortifications, all within a few hours' drive of each other in a way that almost no other country of comparable size can match. The Central Highlands, meanwhile, hold some of the finest tea-growing conditions on the planet, a direct legacy of colonial-era agriculture that has since become a genuine source of national pride rather than a lingering colonial wound. Sinharaja Forest Reserve, one of the last remaining stretches of primary tropical rainforest on the island, shelters a level of endemic biodiversity found almost nowhere else. Birds, amphibians, and plant species that exist on this patch of forest and nowhere else on the planet. It's a small enough reserve to walk across in a long day, yet dense enough in unique species that researchers are still cataloging what lives inside it. Combine that with the elephant gatherings at Minaria, where hundreds of wild elephants converge seasonally around a single reservoir in one of the largest elephant gatherings recorded anywhere in Asia. And you get a country that punches enormously above its size in raw ecological density. For anyone actually planning to visit, Colombo, the commercial capital, is the natural entry point, with colonial-era architecture sitting directly alongside modern towers along the coast. Worth a day, but most visitors treat it as a gateway rather than a destination in itself. From there, the ancient cities of Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, and the rock fortress of Sigiriya form what's often called the cultural triangle. Walkable across a few focused days and best tackled with an early start, since the heat at Sigiriya especially builds fast once the sun clears the tree line. The hill town of Kandy holds the Temple of the Sacred Tooth Relic, one of Buddhism's most revered sites, and the scenic train ride from Kandy through the tea country to Ella is, by most accounts, one of the great train journeys anywhere in the world. Book the observation car seats in advance if you can, because everyone else on that train had the same idea. For wildlife, Yala and Udawalawe National Parks offer some of the most reliable leopard and elephant sightings on the continent, and the southern coastline around Marisa and Gale combines colonial fort towns with genuinely excellent whale-watching seasons. Timing matters here more than people expect. Sri Lanka has two separate monsoon systems affecting different coasts at different times of year, so the best season depends entirely on which side of the island you're heading to, and a trip planned around only one coast's dry season can walk straight into the other coast's wettest months without knowing it. Sri Lanka built irrigation systems 2,000 years ago that are still functioning today, survived 3 separate waves of European colonization without losing its core identity, fought a 26-year civil war, and then had to rebuild from a tsunami and a total economic collapse within the following 2 decades. And through all of it, kept building the tea, the temples, and the wildlife reserves that now draw millions of visitors back to its shores. It's a country that is genuinely ancient and genuinely still figuring out its modern politics. Genuinely beautiful and genuinely scarred by recent history. Genuinely resilient, not as a marketing word, but as a documented, repeated fact about how this island keeps recovering from things that would permanently break smaller, less rooted places. Maybe the real question isn't whether Sri Lanka is what you pictured. It's whether you ever knew just how much history was sitting quietly underneath that picture in the first place. If you learned something here, that's what this channel is for. Like the video, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. There's a lot more of the world left to get wrong about.